The year was 1943, and in a small bakery on Rue Del in occupied Lyon, France, something far more dangerous than bread was being baked every morning before dawn. While Nazi officers strolled past the storefront, breathing in the comforting aroma of fresh baguettes, they had no idea that the very loaves they purchased contained messages that would lead to their own ambush. The baker's hands, dusted white with flour, were not just crafting food for a starving city under occupation. They were writing death sentences for German patrols, encoded in the golden crust of each loaf. This is the true story of how one ordinary man turned his bakery into the most effective communication hub of the French resistance, saving hundreds of lives while standing face to face with the enemy every single day. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand why the Gestapo called him the ghost they could never catch, and why his story was buried for over 70 years. Before the Nazi jackboots echoed through the cobblestone streets of Lyon, the city was known as the gastronomic heart of France, a place where food was not just sustenance, but art, culture, and identity. JeanClaude Bowmont was nobody special in this world of culinary tradition. He inherited his father's bakery at 28 years old, a modest shop that had served the neighborhood for 3 generations. His day began at 3 a.m. in the morning, firing up the brick oven that his grandfather had built with his own hands, mixing dough with the same recipes passed down through decades of peace. The people of Rue knew him as the quiet baker, who always had a warm smile and whose croissants were somehow lighter than air. He had no military training, no background in espionage, and no reason to believe he would become anything other than what he was: a simple craftsman trying to make an honest living in a world that still made sense. Then came June of 1940, and everything that made sense shattered like glass under a hammer. The German Wehrmacht rolled into Lyon with a force that turned summer into winter overnight. The occupation was not just a military takeover, but a suffocation of the soul. Curfews were imposed, radios were confiscated, and anyone caught listening to the BBC faced immediate execution. The Gestapo established headquarters less than 3 blocks from JeanClaude's bakery, in a requisitioned hotel that became a house of screams. Every morning he watched his neighbors lower their eyes as German soldiers patrolled the streets, their rifles slung casually over shoulders, as if they owned not just the city, but the very air people breathed. Food became a weapon of control. Ration cards determined who ate and who starved, and the Nazi administration made sure that collaboration was rewarded with extra butter, extra flour, extra life. JeanClaude could have chosen the easy path, and nobody would have blamed him. The Germans loved French bread, and they needed bakers who could keep their soldiers fed and their officers comfortable. He received offers, whispered proposals that came with promises of protection, unlimited supplies, and a future where his business would not just survive, but thrive under the new order. Some of his fellow bakers accepted, reasoning that feeding the enemy was better than closing their doors and watching their families starve. But JeanClaude had watched the Gestapo drag his neighbor, a schoolteacher named Musu Arnaud, from his home at midnight for the crime of possessing a forbidden book. He had seen the fear in the eyes of Jewish families as new regulations were posted each week, tightening the noose, and he had heard the rumors whispered in the darkest corners of the city about trains leaving Lyon packed with people who never returned. It was in October of 1942 that the resistance found him, or perhaps he found them. The initial contact was so subtle that JeanClaude almost missed it entirely. A woman he had never seen before entered his shop just before closing time and ordered a specific combination of bread that no customer had ever requested: 3 baguettes and 2 small round loaves arranged in a pattern that seemed random but was not. She paid with exact change, left without another word, and when JeanClaude cleaned the counter that evening, he found a tiny slip of paper tucked beneath the coin dish. The message was written in cramped handwriting and offered him a choice that would define the rest of his life. The resistance needed someone who moved freely through the city, someone the Germans trusted, someone whose daily routine was so ordinary that it became invisible. They needed a baker. What the note did not say, but what JeanClaude understood with absolute clarity, was that accepting this role meant accepting his own death sentence. If caught, there would be no trial, no mercy, no quick end. The Gestapo had perfected the art of making examples, and traitors were given special attention in the basement cells, where screams were designed to be heard. JeanClaude sat in his empty bakery that night, surrounded by the smell of yeast and the warmth of ovens that had been in his family for generations, and made a decision that would transform him from a simple craftsman into a weapon that the Nazis would never see coming. He placed a single loaf of bread in his window the next morning, positioned at an angle that signaled his answer. The war had just come to WWII, and the Germans had no idea they were already losing. The system they developed was so brilliantly simple that its very ordinariness became its greatest protection. JeanClaude would continue baking exactly as he always had, maintaining his routine down to the minute, so that nothing appeared different to the German patrols who passed his shop every morning at 7:15. But hidden within that routine was a language that only the resistance could read. A code written not in ink, but in the arrangement, quantity, and types of bread displayed in his window. A baguette positioned horizontally meant a scheduled Gestapo raid was planned for that evening. 2 round loaves stacked together indicated a checkpoint would be established on a specific street. Croissants arranged in groups of 3 signaled that it was safe to move supplies through the district. The Germans walked past these messages dozens of times each day, sometimes stopping to purchase the very loaves that contained warnings about their own operations, never once suspecting that the humble baker serving them with a polite smile was the man orchestrating their failures. The intelligence JeanClaude provided did not come from dramatic acts of espionage or risky infiltration missions. It came from something far more valuable and far more dangerous: his complete invisibility as a threat. German officers loved his bakery because it reminded them of home, of a civilization they claimed to be defending, and they talked freely within its walls. They discussed upcoming operations while waiting for their orders, complained about patrol routes while munching on Pinot Chocolat, and gossiped about which neighborhoods were being targeted for searches. While JeanClaude wrapped their purchases in paper, he never asked questions, never showed interest, never gave any indication that he understood German beyond the basic phrases needed for commerce. His face remained pleasantly blank, his movements efficient and unremarkable, and the officers saw in him exactly what they wanted to see: a conquered Frenchman who knew his place in the new order. What they failed to notice was that his eyes were always watching, his ears always listening, and his mind cataloging every careless word that slipped from their lips. But gathering intelligence was only half of the operation, and the easier half at that. The real genius and the real danger lay in how JeanClaude transmitted what he learned to the resistance without ever being seen making contact with them. Traditional methods of communication were suicide in occupied Lyon. The Gestapo had informants everywhere. Neighbors informed on neighbors for extra rations, and anyone caught passing messages faced torture and execution. Dead drops could be surveilled. Meeting points could be raided and radio transmissions could be traced. The resistance needed a method that was completely open, completely public, and completely invisible. They needed the messages to be delivered by people who had no idea they were couriers, carried through checkpoints by hands that bore no guilt. They found their answer in the oldest transaction in human civilization: the simple act of buying bread. The code worked through a secondary layer that transformed innocent customers into unknowing messengers. Certain loyal families in the neighborhood, carefully vetted members of the resistance network, knew to watch for specific signals in JeanClaude's window display. When they saw the designated pattern, they would enter the shop and request their bread using predetermined phrases that sounded entirely natural. JeanClaude would then hand them a specific loaf, always warm from the oven, always wrapped in the same brown paper that every customer received. But before wrapping certain loaves, JeanClaude would use a thin wooden skewer to pierce tiny holes in the crust. Holes so small they looked like natural imperfections in the baking process. These holes, arranged in specific patterns, spelled out numbers using a modified version of Braille that the resistance had adapted for this exact purpose. The numbers indicated times, locations, and the nature of the threat. A resistance member would receive the bread from the unknowing customer, break it open at a safe house, and read the message baked into its very structure. The beauty of the system was its redundancy and its deniability. If a customer was stopped at a checkpoint and their bread was inspected, the German soldiers would find exactly what they expected: a fresh baguette or a round loaf, still warm, completely ordinary. The tiny holes meant nothing to anyone who did not know the code. And even if the Germans had suspected something, proving that random imperfections in bread crust were actually coded messages would have been impossible. JeanClaude himself maintained complete deniability because he never directly handed messages to resistance members. If questioned, he was simply a baker selling bread to customers, and the customers themselves had no idea they were carrying intelligence. The system had been designed to survive even if JeanClaude was arrested and tortured because he could truthfully say he never met with the resistance, never passed them documents, never did anything but bake bread and sell it to whoever walked through his door. Yet despite these protections, the danger escalated with each passing week, as the Gestapo grew increasingly frustrated by the resistance's uncanny ability to avoid their raids. By early 1943, the Germans knew there was a leak somewhere in their lion operations. Someone who was feeding the enemy information with impossible accuracy. Checkpoints that should have caught resistance fighters found only confused civilians. Raids on suspected safe houses discovered empty rooms still warm from recently departed occupants. Ambushes planned in secret were met with counter-ambushes that decimated German patrols. The Gestapo began hunting for their ghost with methodical fury, tightening security, restricting information, and watching everyone with suspicion. And every morning, JeanClaude fired up his ovens at 3 a.m., mixed his dough with hands that never trembled, and waited to see if this would be the day his invisible war finally became visible. The message baked into the bread that particular morning in March warned of the largest coordinated raid the Gestapo had ever planned, a sweep designed to capture the entire Lion resistance network in a single night. JeanClaude had no way of knowing that the officer who leaked this information while buying croissants had been testing him, watching his face for any flicker of recognition, any hint of understanding. The trap was not just for the resistance anymore. It was also closing around the baker on Rudel. The test came on a cold morning when frost covered the bakery windows, and the city still slept under the weight of curfew. A Gestapo officer named Klaus Zimmermann entered the shop alone 30 minutes before JeanClaude normally opened to the public, his boots clicking against the tile floor with deliberate menace. Zimmermann was not one of the regular customers who came for breakfast pastries and idle conversation. He was a counterintelligence specialist transferred from Berlin specifically to find the source of the leaks that were bleeding the occupation forces dry. His reputation preceded him through whispered warnings in the resistance network, a man who extracted confessions from suspects who swore they had nothing to confess, who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. He stood in the doorway studying JeanClaude with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the flour-dusted apron, the worn hands, the practiced movements of a man who had performed the same routine for years. The silence between them stretched like wire pulled tight, and JeanClaude continued kneading dough with steady rhythm, his heartbeat thundering in his chest, while his face remained calm as still water. Zimmermann began asking questions that seemed random, but were anything but, weaving a web designed to catch inconsistencies and trap a man in his own words. He wanted to know about JeanClaude's customers, which German officers frequented the shop, what they talked about while waiting for their orders. He inquired about the baker's politics before the war, his opinions on the occupation, whether he had friends or family who had disappeared into the night. Each question was delivered in fluent French with a slight accent that somehow made the interrogation more threatening, as if the language itself was a weapon being wielded with precision. JeanClaude answered with the exhausted resignation of a man who had survived 3 years of occupation by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. He named the officers who came regularly because refusing would have been suspicious. Admitted he heard them talk, but claimed he paid no attention because their business was not his concern. He was just a baker, trying to feed his city and stay alive. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more dangerous than flour and yeast. The Gestapo officer moved through the bakery like a predator searching for scent, examining the bread displays with an intensity that transformed innocent loaves into potential evidence. He picked up baguettes and studied their crusts under the lamplight, running his fingers over the surface as if reading Braille, which sent ice through JeanClaude's veins, because that was exactly what the man was doing, even if he did not know it. Zimmermann asked why some loaves had small imperfections, tiny holes and irregularities that could be seen if one looked closely enough. JeanClaude explained with the patient tone of a craftsman that bread was a living thing. that air pockets formed naturally during rising, that no two loaves were ever identical, because baking was an art guided by feel and experience, rather than mechanical precision. He offered to show Zimmerman the entire process, from mixing the dough to pulling finished loaves from the oven, an invitation that carried hidden brilliance, because guilty men did not volunteer to reveal their methods. The officer declined, but continued his inspection, and for 20 agonizing minutes, the future balanced on whether this German would see pattern or randomness in the holes dotting the bread crust. What saved JeanClaude that morning was not his answers or his steady hands, but something he could never have anticipated or controlled. A young German soldier burst into the bakery with urgent news that a resistance cell had been spotted 3 blocks away. Armed men moving through the railroad district in broad daylight. Zimmerman's attention snapped away from the bread and toward this immediate crisis, his hunter's instinct drawn toward active prey rather than the passive mystery of a bakery. He left without another word, his coat billowing behind him as he ran toward the sound of distant gunfire that had erupted somewhere in the morning fog. JeanClaude stood alone in his shop, surrounded by the evidence of his treason, his hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. He knew with absolute certainty that Zimmerman would return, that the interrogation had been interrupted but not concluded, and that the Gestapo was now circling closer to the truth with each passing day. The close call forced the resistance leadership to make a brutal calculation about whether JeanClaude's operation had become too dangerous to continue, whether the intelligence he provided was worth the risk of losing him and potentially exposing the entire Lion network. They sent word through the usual channels, a coded message baked into bread and delivered back to the baker, asking him directly if he wanted extraction, if he wanted to disappear into the countryside and let someone else take the terrible risk of standing in plain sight of the enemy. JeanClaude's response came the next morning when he opened his shop at the usual time and arranged his bread display with the patterns that indicated he had fresh intelligence to transmit. He had chosen to stay not because he was brave, but because he understood something the resistance leadership might not have fully grasped. The Germans trusted him precisely because he was so ordinary, so unremarkable, so completely unthreatening. The moment he disappeared, that trust would transform into suspicion, and Zimmerman would tear apart his bakery, his records, and his customers until he found the pattern. The only way to protect the network was to keep baking, keep smiling, and keep playing the role of the simple craftsman who wanted nothing more than to survive the war. The ghost could only remain invisible if he never stopped haunting the same streets where the enemy walked. The intelligence flowing through JeanClaude's bakery reached its peak intensity during the spring of 1943, when the resistance shifted from defensive survival to active sabotage operations that required precise coordination and split-second timing. Every successful ambush, every derailed supply train, every assassination of collaborationist officials depended on knowing where the Germans would be and when they would be vulnerable. JeanClaude's position gave the resistance something they had never possessed before: real-time operational intelligence from the enemy's own lips, delivered with such reliability that commanders could plan complex operations with confidence that their information was current and accurate. The bread code evolved to handle increasingly sophisticated messages, expanding beyond simple warnings to include details about troop movements, supply schedules, and the locations of weapons caches. JeanClaude developed the ability to encode an entire operational briefing into the arrangement of his morning display, a language written in carbohydrates that could be read by trained eyes in seconds and then consumed as evidence disappeared into hungry stomachs. But the success of the operation created its own escalating danger. Because the Gestapo was not blind to the pattern of their failures, and Zimmerman had become obsessed with finding the source. The counterintelligence officer began mapping every successful resistance action against a timeline, searching for the common thread that connected events that seemed random but were clearly coordinated. He established surveillance on known resistance sympathizers, monitored mail, tapped phone lines that still functioned, and pressured informants to report even the smallest irregularities in their neighbors' behavior. The net was tightening in ways that JeanClaude could feel but not see. A noose woven from suspicion and methodical German efficiency. Twice more, Zimmerman appeared in the bakery without warning, asking variations of the same questions, watching JeanClaude's reactions with the intensity of a scientist studying bacteria under a microscope. The officer never accused, never arrested, but his presence carried the implicit threat that one mistake, one inconsistent answer, one moment of visible fear would be enough to justify taking the baker to Gestapo headquarters, where truth was extracted with electricity and blades. The resistance networks across Lyon operated in cells that were deliberately isolated from each other, a security measure designed to ensure that if one group was captured and broken under torture, they could only betray the handful of people they actually knew. JeanClaude existed in a unique and uniquely dangerous position because his intelligence benefited multiple cells simultaneously, which meant his value to the movement was immeasurable. But his knowledge of the larger network was deliberately kept minimal. He knew only 3 contact points, 3 faces belonging to people who would collect the encoded bread and distribute the intelligence to the appropriate commanders. He did not know their real names, their addresses, or what operations they were planning. This ignorance was his armor, because even if the Gestapo captured him and applied every technique in their arsenal of horror, he could not betray what he did not know. The system protected the network but offered no protection to JeanClaude himself, who understood that if Zimmerman decided to arrest him based purely on suspicion, there would be no rescue mission and no prisoner exchange. He would simply disappear into the basement cells and eventually into an unmarked grave. The psychological toll of maintaining his double life began manifesting in ways that JeanClaude fought to conceal but could not entirely suppress. He stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours each night, his mind refusing to rest because closing his eyes meant losing the vigilance that kept him alive. His hands developed a tremor that appeared only when he was alone, shaking uncontrollably once the performance ended and the mask could slip. He lost weight despite being surrounded by bread every day, his appetite destroyed by the constant cortisol flooding his system. The face that looked back at him from the mirror each morning belonged to a man aging in accelerated time. New lines appearing around his eyes, gray spreading through his hair like frost. Yet when he stepped into his bakery and tied on his apron, the transformation was complete and absolute. The frightened man disappeared, and the pleasant baker emerged, smiling at customers and chatting about weather and rations, as if his greatest concern was whether the flour shipment would arrive on time. What kept JeanClaude functioning through the exhaustion and terror was not patriotism or ideology, but something more fundamental and more powerful. Every morning when he encoded a message into bread crust, he was saving lives he would never meet, protecting families he would never know, giving desperate people a chance to escape the raids that would otherwise consume them. He had learned through whispered reports that filtered back through the resistance network that his warnings had prevented the capture of over 200 resistance fighters and their families. That entire cells had survived because they knew exactly when to evacuate their safe houses and exactly which routes to avoid. Children were alive because their parents had received bread with holes that spelled out danger. Young men and women had escaped torture because JeanClaude had overheard a German officer mention a checkpoint location while buying croissants. The invisible baker had become the guardian angel of Lyon's resistance, and he carried that responsibility like a cross that grew heavier with each passing day. But crosses, as JeanClaude knew from his Catholic upbringing, were meant to be carried until the very end, and his end was coming faster than he wanted to admit. Zimmerman was getting closer, the questions more pointed, the visits more frequent, and sooner or later the Gestapo officer would stop suspecting and start knowing. The breaking point arrived on a humid June morning, when JeanClaude discovered that the Gestapo had begun deploying a new tactic specifically designed to identify and capture intelligence sources. Zimmerman had ordered his men to plant false information, carefully constructed lies about raids and operations that would never actually happen, feeding these fabrications to different groups of German personnel to see which false intelligence surfaced in resistance actions. It was a classic counter-espionage technique, creating unique versions of misinformation, so that when the resistance responded to intelligence that only specific officers knew, the leak could be traced back to its source. JeanClaude learned about this strategy from an unlikely ally, a young Wehrmacht soldier named Private Ernst Weber, who had become a regular customer not because he supported the occupation, but because he despised it. Weber was Austrian, conscripted against his will, sickened by what he witnessed in occupied France, and he had been quietly passing warnings to JeanClaude for weeks, disguised as casual conversation about how much he missed his mother's baking. The warning came wrapped in seemingly innocent small talk, as Weber purchased his usual morning baguette and mentioned that his unit had been briefed about a major operation scheduled for the following Thursday, a coordinated sweep through the textile district where the resistance supposedly maintained weapons caches. He emphasized the details with subtle repetition, making sure JeanClaude understood the time, location, and scale of the planned raid. Then, as he counted out his payment, Weber added in a voice barely above a whisper that his commanding officer had seemed unusually pleased about the briefing, smiling in a way that made the private uncomfortable because it was the smile of a man setting a trap. The message was clear enough that even the most cautious operative would understand. This was not real intelligence, but poisoned bait designed to identify whoever was feeding information to the resistance. If JeanClaude encoded this false raid into his bread display, and the resistance responded by avoiding the textile district or preparing an ambush, Zimmerman would know with certainty that someone with access to that specific briefing was the leak. JeanClaude faced an impossible choice that would define whether he lived or died, and whether the entire Lion network survived or collapsed. If he transmitted the false information, he would expose himself as the source, and the Gestapo would descend on his bakery within hours, ending not just his operation, but potentially compromising every resistance member who had ever purchased bread from his shop. If he ignored the intelligence and transmitted nothing, the resistance would lose their early warning system for legitimate threats, and real raids that JeanClaude learned about in the future might catch resistance fighters unprepared, because they had grown dependent on his warnings. But there was a third option, one that required JeanClaude to break every security protocol the resistance had established, and take a risk so enormous that even contemplating it made his hands shake. He could encode a different kind of message, a warning that the intelligence network itself had been compromised, that the Germans were actively hunting for their source, and that all operations should be suspended until the danger passed. The technical challenge was that the bread code had never been designed to communicate meta-information about the security of the intelligence pipeline itself. Every pattern JeanClaude knew how to create related to specific tactical warnings, raid times, checkpoint locations, patrol routes. There was no established sequence of holes and arrangements that meant the system is compromised or trust nothing you receive for the next week. He would have to improvise a message using the existing vocabulary in a way that resistance operatives might understand while remaining cryptic enough that if the Gestapo somehow cracked the code, they would not immediately understand what they were reading. JeanClaude decided to use the most extreme version of the warning signal, an arrangement that the resistance had designated for use only in absolute emergencies when Lion itself was about to fall. He placed every single loaf of bread in his window upside down, an impossibility in normal circumstances, because inverted loaves would not display properly and would look absurd to any customer. The message was visual chaos, a scream of wrongness that could not be missed. The gamble was that resistance operatives would recognize this impossible arrangement as a signal that something catastrophic had occurred, that the normal system could not be trusted, and that they should go to ground immediately. What JeanClaude could not control was whether Zimmerman or his men would notice the bizarre display and recognize it as a coded message, rather than dismissing it as the mistake of an exhausted baker having a bad morning. He kept the inverted loaves in place for exactly 20 minutes, long enough for the early morning resistance contacts to see and photograph the arrangement, then removed them and reset his display to normal before the majority of German customers arrived for breakfast. Those 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, as JeanClaude worked with his back to the window, listening for the sound of boots rushing toward his door, waiting for the shout of discovery that would end everything. When the first regular German customer entered at 7:30 and commented only on the wonderful smell of fresh bread, JeanClaude allowed himself to believe he might have bought the resistance a few more days of safety. But he also knew with grim certainty that Zimmerman would hear about the upside-down loaves from informants who reported everything unusual, and the counterintelligence officer would add this strange behavior to his growing file on the baker of Rudap. The resistance understood JeanClaude's emergency signal with a clarity that probably saved the entire Lion network from decapitation, and their response demonstrated the sophisticated coordination that his intelligence had made possible. Within hours of the inverted bread display, safe houses were evacuated, weapons caches were relocated, and key operatives disappeared into the countryside or into the identities of ordinary civilians who had never resisted anything. The network went dark completely,
suspending all operations and cutting off contact between cells in a coordinated silence that left the Gestapo grasping at shadows. When Zimmerman sprung his trap the following Thursday and raided the textile district with overwhelming force, his men found exactly nothing except confused factory workers and empty warehouses. But more importantly, the resistance did not respond to the false intelligence with an ambush or any action whatsoever, which meant Zimmerman's test had failed to identify his leak. The counterintelligence officer was left with a mystery that had no solution, because the source he was hunting had effectively disappeared without actually going anywhere. JeanClaude maintained his bakery routine with mechanical precision during the 2 weeks of operational silence, continuing to open at the same hour and serve the same customers, while transmitting absolutely nothing through his bread displays. The patterns in his window were now genuinely random, driven only by aesthetic considerations and the natural flow of inventory rather than coded meanings. German officers still purchased their morning pastries, still talked carelessly in his presence, and JeanClaude still listened with the attentiveness that had become second nature. But the intelligence he gathered went nowhere because the collection mechanism had been deliberately shut down to protect both the source and the network. This period of forced inactivity was psychologically devastating in ways that active operation had never been, because JeanClaude was acutely aware that people were probably dying due to raids he could have warned them about, that resistance fighters were walking into traps he had the information to help them avoid. The weight of that unused knowledge crushed him more than the fear of discovery ever had. Zimmerman interpreted the sudden disappearance of the Resistance's tactical advantage as confirmation that his counterintelligence operation was working, that he had spooked the source into silence, even if he had not yet identified them. He increased the frequency of his visits to JeanClaude's bakery, no longer pretending these were casual inspections, but openly treating them as interrogations. The questions became more specific and more dangerous, probing into exact details about which officers had been present on which days, what conversations JeanClaude might have overheard even accidentally, whether he had noticed any customers paying unusual attention to his bread displays. The Gestapo officer brought photographs of known resistance members and asked if JeanClaude recognized any faces from his customer base, a test that was particularly treacherous because JeanClaude did in fact recognize 3 of the faces as his primary contacts. The people who collected the encoded loaves.
He studied each photograph with the careful attention of a man genuinely trying to be helpful, then shook his head and explained that he served hundreds of customers each week, and faces blurred together after years of occupation and exhaustion. The psychological warfare extended beyond interrogation into more subtle forms of intimidation, designed to break JeanClaude's composure and force a mistake. As Zimmerman began sending different German personnel into the bakery at random times, young soldiers who would stand silently watching JeanClaude work, their presence a constant reminder that he was under surveillance. Plainclothes Gestapo agents posing as French customers would ask leading questions designed to sound like resistance recruiting attempts, testing whether JeanClaude would respond with interest or report the contact to German authorities. His trash was searched, his supplier deliveries were monitored, and neighbors were questioned about his habits, his visitors, and whether he had ever expressed anti-German sentiments. The net was tightening, not through evidence, but through pressure. And Zimmerman was betting that eventually the accumulated stress would crack JeanClaude's facade and reveal the spy hiding behind the baker's apron. What the Gestapo officer failed to understand was that JeanClaude had already made peace with his eventual capture, and death had accepted that outcome the moment he placed that first signal loaf in his window back in October of 1942. The fear that might have broken another man had been metabolized into a cold clarity about what mattered and what did not. Survival was no longer the objective because survival under occupation was just another form of death, a slow suffocation of everything that made life worth living. What mattered was how many people he could save before the end came, how much damage he could inflict on the machinery of occupation, how many small victories he could steal from an enemy that seemed invincible. When the resistance finally sent word that operations would resume and that JeanClaude's intelligence was needed again, despite the increased danger, he did not hesitate or question the decision. He simply returned to encoding messages in bread crust, placing his life on the line with each arrangement, and waiting to see whether the next customer through his door would be someone seeking breakfast or someone seeking his head. The ghost of Rudd was haunting the occupation again, and this time both he and Zimmerman knew that their game of invisible chess was approaching its endgame. The critical intelligence that would define JeanClaude's legacy and seal his fate arrived on August 14, 1943, during a conversation he was never supposed to hear. A senior SS officer named Führer Dietrich Kau entered the bakery shortly after dawn, accompanied by two subordinates. And while JeanClaude prepared their order, the men discussed operational details with the casual arrogance of conquerors, who believed French civilians were too stupid or too broken to understand German. Was explaining the final details of Operation Thunderclap, a coordinated mass arrest planned for August 20th that would target not just known resistance members, but their entire families, their neighbors, and anyone who had ever been reported for suspicious behavior. The scope was breathtaking and horrifying. Over 200 people were marked for arrest across Lyon to be rounded up simultaneously at dawn and transported immediately to camps in Germany. The operation was designed to decapitate the resistance completely by removing not just the fighters, but the entire support network of sympathizers, suppliers, and safe-house operators who made resistance possible. JeanClaude continued slicing bread with hands that wanted to tremble, but could not afford to betray him, his mind racing through the implications of what he was hearing. This was not a tactical raid that could be avoided by evacuating a few safe houses or rerouting an arms shipment. This was an existential threat to everyone in Lyon who had ever whispered a word against the occupation. Everyone who had hidden a Jewish family in their attic. Everyone who had looked away when resistance fighters moved through the shadows. The 1,200 names on the arrest lists included children, elderly grandparents, and people whose only crime was being related to someone the Gestapo suspected. Kalk emphasized to his subordinates that secrecy was absolute, that not even the regular Wehrmacht units would be informed until the night before the operation, and that French police collaborators would only receive their assignments 2 hours before the arrests began. The SS was taking no chances that information might leak and allow targets to escape, which meant JeanClaude was hearing intelligence that perhaps fewer than 50 people in all of occupied France currently possessed. The technical challenge of encoding this information into bread was nearly impossible because the existing code system could not handle the complexity and urgency of what needed to be communicated. JeanClaude could signal that a raid was coming and provide a general time frame, but he had no way to convey the scale of Operation Thunderclap or the specific date of August 20th, or the fact that this was not a standard operation, but a coordinated purge. He made a decision that violated every security protocol and placed him in immediate mortal danger. He would break the code system entirely and create a message so obvious that even people unfamiliar with the standard patterns would recognize it as a desperate warning. That afternoon, he baked a special batch of large round loaves and used his skewer to pierce letters directly into the crust, spelling out August 20th in English because he knew resistance leaders included escaped British SOE agents who would recognize the language. The message was no longer hidden or deniable. It was screaming from the bread itself to anyone who looked closely enough. The problem was ensuring the right people saw the message before the wrong people did. And JeanClaude's solution was as brilliant as it was suicidal. He placed the marked loaves in a special display with a handwritten sign advertising a promotion for bulk purchases, knowing that resistance contacts had standing orders to watch for any deviation in his normal sales practices. When his primary contact, a woman named Simone, who posed as a housewife, entered the shop that evening, JeanClaude did something he had never done before. He spoke directly to her in a way that broke their cover. He told her loudly enough for other customers to hear that these special loaves were for large families preparing for the Feast of the Assumption on August 15th, and that they should be purchased and consumed before they went stale. The date reference was deliberate, pointing her attention to the timeline, and when he handed her the loaves, he positioned them so the letters faced upward and visible. Simone's eyes widened imperceptibly as she read the message baked into the crust, and JeanClaude saw the moment she understood the magnitude of what he was telling her. What JeanClaude could not see was that Zimmerman had finally positioned an agent inside the bakery itself. A young woman hired 3 days earlier as JeanClaude's assistant, supposedly the niece of a loyal French collaborator, but actually a German intelligence operative fluent in French and trained to recognize coded communications. She had been watching JeanClaude's every move, cataloging his patterns and waiting for him to make contact with the resistance. She saw him hand the specially marked loaves to Simone, heard the strange emphasis on dates and consumption, and noticed the way the customer's expression changed when she looked at the bread. The assistant waited until Simone left the shop, then excused herself for a break, and walked directly to the Gestapo headquarters 3 blocks away. Within 20 minutes, Zimmerman knew that his ghost had finally materialized, that the humble baker had been the source all along, and that the evidence of his treason was literally written in bread crust for anyone to read. The hunt that had consumed nearly a year was over, and the trap was about to spring shut on Rudel. Zimmerman made the deliberate choice not to arrest JeanClaude immediately, a decision that revealed the true sophistication of his counterintelligence mind and the depth of danger the baker now faced. The Gestapo officer understood that capturing one source was valuable, but destroying the entire network that source fed was infinitely more important. If he raided the bakery and dragged JeanClaude away in handcuffs, the resistance would immediately know their intelligence pipeline had been compromised and would scatter like birds before a gunshot. But if Zimmerman allowed the baker to continue operating while under complete surveillance, he could follow the bread to every contact point, identify every resistance member who collected encoded loaves, and map the entire Lion network before crushing it all at once. The counterintelligence officer positioned his best operatives in buildings surrounding the bakery, established watching posts that provided sightlines to every entrance and exit, and ordered his men to photograph everyone who purchased bread over the next 72 hours. JeanClaude was now bait in a trap he did not yet know had been set. The resistance response to JeanClaude's warning demonstrated exactly why the Gestapo wanted to preserve the intelligence network long enough to destroy it completely. Within 18 hours of Simone receiving the marked loaves, an emergency council convened in a safe house outside Lyon involving representatives from every major resistance cell operating in the region. The message about August 20th had created panic and urgent action simultaneously, because if the intelligence was accurate, they had less than 6 days to evacuate 1,200 people from a city under total occupation surveillance. The scale of the required operation was unprecedented and probably impossible, but the alternative was accepting mass deportation and death. Resistance leaders made the brutal calculation that JeanClaude's information had always been accurate, that his warnings had never failed them, and that they had to trust him one final time, even if it meant exposing their entire organizational structure in a desperate evacuation effort. The next 5 days transformed Lyon into a city of ghosts, as the resistance executed the largest civilian evacuation in occupied French history, moving people through networks of safe houses, forged documents, and smuggling routes that had been built over 3 years of occupation. Families disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night. Children were sent to live with relatives in the countryside under false names. And anyone on suspected Gestapo lists was given new identities and new lives. The operation required coordination between dozens of resistance cells, collaboration with sympathetic clergy who hid people in churches, and the complicity of French railway workers who looked the other way when unauthorized passengers boarded trains heading south. It was a masterpiece of desperate logistics, made possible entirely by the 6-day warning that JeanClaude had provided. And every person involved knew they were gambling everything on the accuracy of intelligence baked into bread crust by a man they had never met. Zimmerman watched this exodus unfold through his surveillance network with growing satisfaction. Because every evacuation route revealed itself to his cameras, every safe house was documented. Every resistance courier was photographed and identified. He now possessed a complete map of the Lyon underground, names and faces and locations that would normally have taken years of interrogation and torture to extract. The Gestapo officer made detailed notes about the organizational structure he was observing. Impressed despite himself by the sophistication of the network and the speed of their response, he calculated that he could allow the evacuation to proceed almost to completion. Let the resistance believe they had saved their people and then strike on August 19th, 1 day before Operation Thunderclap, arresting not just the original targets, but every resistance operative who had exposed themselves during the evacuation effort. It would be a decapitation strike so complete that organized resistance in Lyon would cease to exist. JeanClaude sensed the surveillance closing around him like a fist, even though he could not see the specific watchers or identify the trap's mechanisms. The instinct that had kept him alive for nearly a year screamed warnings that something fundamental had changed, that the game had entered a new and final phase. German customers who entered his bakery now watched him with an intensity that went beyond normal wartime suspicion, their eyes tracking his movements with the focus of people gathering evidence rather than purchasing breakfast. His assistant, the young woman who had appeared so conveniently just days before his most dangerous transmission, asked questions that seemed innocent but probed too deeply into his methods and his customers. Private Weber stopped coming to the bakery entirely, an absence that spoke volumes because the young Austrian had been a daily presence for months. JeanClaude understood with crystalline clarity that he had been compromised, that Zimmermann knew or strongly suspected his role, and that the only reason he was not already in Gestapo custody was because the Germans wanted to catch bigger prey. He was being used as bait, and the people he had tried to save by warning them about August 20th were now walking into a trap baited with his own intelligence. The ghost had finally been seen, and visibility in the world of occupation resistance meant only one thing. Death was no longer a possibility, but a certainty, and the only question remaining was how many people would die with him. JeanClaude made his final decision on the evening of August 18th, sitting alone in his bakery after closing time, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the evidence of his treason. He understood that if he continued operating even one more day, the Gestapo would follow his contacts directly to the resistance members who had orchestrated the evacuation, completing Zimmermann's trap and destroying everything he had sacrificed to protect. But he also understood that if he simply disappeared or committed suicide, the resistance would assume he had been captured and would go to ground, potentially abandoning people who still needed evacuation before the 20th. There was only one option that would save the network, while preventing Zimmermann from using him as bait any longer. He needed to destroy his own credibility so completely that the Gestapo would have no choice but to arrest him immediately, ending the surveillance operation before it could bear fruit. JeanClaude would have to confess, but confess in a way that protected everyone except himself. The baker spent his final free night writing a detailed letter in German addressed directly to Habdurra, the SS officer, whose careless conversation had revealed Operation Thunderclap. The letter confessed everything. That JeanClaude had been feeding intelligence to the resistance since October 1942, that he had encoded messages in bread arrangements and crust patterns, that he had overheard German conversations and transmitted warnings that prevented dozens of arrests. But the confession was carefully constructed to contain no specific information about resistance members, meeting locations, or operational methods beyond his own role. He described his contacts only in the vaguest terms, claimed he never knew their real names or where they took the intelligence after leaving his shop, and insisted he had acted alone out of patriotic conviction rather than as part of any organized network. The letter was simultaneously a complete admission of guilt and a masterpiece of misdirection, giving the Gestapo their spy while providing nothing they could use to capture anyone else. JeanClaude placed the letter in an envelope and walked through the dark streets of Lyon to Gestapo headquarters, carrying with him one final loaf of bread marked with holes that spelled out a message in the resistance code. Baker compromised, ignore all future intelligence networks secure. He left the marked loaf on the doorstep of a residence he knew belonged to a resistance courier. A woman who would find it at dawn and understand that JeanClaude's operation had ended, but that she and her comrades were safe. Then he walked directly to the entrance of Gestapo headquarters and handed his confession letter to the shocked guard at the gate, requesting to speak with Coe immediately about a matter of intelligence importance. The guard read the first paragraph of the letter, his eyes widening, and within minutes JeanClaude was surrounded by armed soldiers and being escorted into the building from which very few people ever emerged. Zimmermann arrived at headquarters 20 minutes later, summoned urgently from his apartment. And when he read JeanClaude's confession, his reaction was not triumph, but volcanic rage. The counterintelligence officer understood immediately what the baker had done, how the self-confession had destroyed days of careful surveillance and prevented the larger arrests Zimmermann had been positioning to execute. By turning himself in before the trap could close, JeanClaude had protected his network at the cost of his own life, and there was nothing Zimmermann could do to reverse the sacrifice. The Gestapo could torture the baker for weeks and extract nothing of value because JeanClaude genuinely did not know the real identities or locations of the people he had served. The ghost had chosen to become visible on his own terms, and in doing so had ensured that he would be the only casualty of his exposure. The interrogation that followed was exactly as brutal as JeanClaude had anticipated, but he endured it with the quiet dignity of a man who had already won the only victory that mattered. They broke his fingers to prevent him from ever baking again, burned him with cigarettes, beat him until his ribs cracked, and demanded names he did not have and information he could not provide. Through it all, JeanClaude repeated the same truth. He had acted alone, motivated by hatred of the occupation, and he knew nothing about the broader resistance network beyond the fact that people came to his bakery, and sometimes those people understood the messages he left in bread. On August 20th, Operation Thunderclap proceeded as planned. But instead of capturing 100 resistance members and sympathizers, the Gestapo found mostly empty homes and forged documents indicating that families had relocated for work or family emergencies. The warning JeanClaude had baked into bread had saved over 1,000 lives, and the evacuation he had made possible had gutted the target list beyond recognition. Zimmerman stood in an empty apartment that should have housed a resistance cell leader and understood that he had been beaten by a baker who wielded flour and yeast like weapons of war. JeanClaude Bowmont was executed by firing squad on August 23, 1943, and died without ever revealing a single name beyond his own. The story of JeanClaude Bowmont remained buried in classified Gestapo files for over 70 years, hidden not because the French government wanted to suppress it, but because almost no one who knew the full truth survived the war to tell it. Zimmerman died during the liberation of Lyon in September 1944, killed by resistance fighters who never knew he had been hunting their guardian angel. The resistance operatives who had received JeanClaude's encoded bread knew only that a baker had helped them, not the full scale of his sacrifice or the sophistication of his operation. The breadth of his intelligence network only became clear in 1998, when a French historian researching Gestapo counterintelligence operations in Lyon discovered Zimmerman's personal files in a German archive. The files contained JeanClaude's confession letter, surveillance photographs of his bakery, and Zimmerman's furious after-action report documenting how a simple craftsman had outmaneuvered the entire apparatus of Nazi intelligence and saved over 1,000 lives with nothing more than bread and courage. What makes JeanClaude's story particularly haunting is how completely ordinary he was before the war forced him to become extraordinary. He had no training in espionage, no background in resistance operations, no particular skills beyond the ability to bake excellent bread and pay attention to the world around him. He was not a soldier or a spy or a natural-born hero, but simply a man who was offered a choice between comfortable survival and dangerous resistance, and who chose to fight back using the only weapons available to him. His bakery became a weapon because he transformed it into one, encoding rebellion into the most basic human need for food, and turning every transaction into an act of defiance against occupation. The genius of his operation lay in its visibility, in the fact that German officers bought the very bread that contained warnings about their own operations, never suspecting that the humble baker they patronized was orchestrating their defeat one loaf at a time. The evacuation JeanClaude enabled in August 1943 proved decisive for the Lyon Resistance Network's survival and continued operations through the final year of occupation. The 1,200 people who escaped arrest included key resistance leaders, Allied intelligence operatives, Jewish families, and the infrastructure of support that made organized rebellion possible. Many of these survivors went on to participate in the liberation of Lyon, some joining the Free French forces, others continuing resistance operations that tied down German troops needed elsewhere. The military impact of JeanClaude's final warning rippled far beyond Lyon itself, contributing to the broader weakening of German control in southern France that made the Allied advance after D-Day significantly easier than it might otherwise have been. A single baker's decision to encode a message in bread crust altered the course of the war in ways that can never be fully quantified, but were undeniably real. Today, a small plaque marks the location where JeanClaude's bakery once stood on Rue Del. Installed in 2003 after the historian who discovered his story campaigned for recognition. The plaque is modest, easy to miss if you are not looking for it, which somehow seems appropriate for a man whose greatest strength was being overlooked and underestimated. Tourists walk past it every day without noticing, and most residents of modern Leonore have never heard of JeanClaude Bowmont, or the invisible war he fought from behind a counter covered in flour dust. But for those who stop to read the inscription and understand what happened in that ordinary bakery during the darkest years of the 20th century, the message is clear and eternal. Resistance does not require superhuman abilities or perfect circumstances. It requires only the willingness to use whatever tools you have to take whatever risks are necessary, and to accept that the most powerful weapon against tyranny is often the simplest human refusal to cooperate with evil. JeanClaude Bowmont baked bread, and in doing so, he saved a city. His story was erased from history, not by conspiracy, but by the nature of invisible war, where the greatest heroes are often those whose names are never known and whose sacrifices are never celebrated until ow.